Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's PMI Friday webinar. It's great to see you all after our summer break. My name is Susanna Clark, and I'm going to be facilitating today. So that includes running all the Q&A and chat. So we're going to be using that throughout the presentation today. You can find these buttons on your Zoom control panel. Please do keep your questions coming, any comments you have, and any observations, and I will be putting them to Damion. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we're going to send all registered participants a link via email early next week to the full recording of both the audio and the presentation. As usual, we're also broadcasting live on Facebook and LinkedIn, and this time we're also broadcasting live on YouTube. So welcome to everyone who's joining us on those live streams. If you do want to participate in polls in the future, receive the recording via email, or make any suggestions about future topics for our webinars, then please do register at pmi.co.uk/webinars. We're also going to be sending a short voice to the customer survey at the end of today's session, and we'd be really grateful if you can give us any feedback that you have, particularly any suggestions for future topics that you'd like us to cover. So today's topic is improving through the voice of the customer. This is very much something that's been on people's minds and has been requested. So I'm going to hand over to Damion. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Susanna. So welcome everyone to this week's webinar. I'm very honoured to be the one that's running the first of the new schedule as we come back online. So my name is Damion Albinson, a senior consultant with PMI. I've been with PMI now for 9 years, but I've been in the role of business improvement for the best part of the last 20 years. So what I want to cover today, I want to start off by exploring who are our customers and look at some of the theory around that. And then what are the options for gathering customer data, because there are more than one. And then finally, how do we put that data into use? What do we do with it once we've gathered it, or if we've gathered it? So that's what today's about. So I'd like to start off today with a poll in good old traditional fashion. And so the poll is this: in your current role, is it obvious how your work adds value to your customers of your organization? So that's specifically your role, as opposed to, does your company add value? So you've got the choices: yes, somewhat, no, or perhaps you're just unsure. So Susanna, if you could launch that poll for me, and let's see what we get coming back in.
Okay, so everybody, you should be able to see that on your screen now. And I can see that people are starting to select their options. It's just one option today, so it's not multiple choice. So pick the one that works best for you. And as Damion said, this is about in your role and your work as opposed to your organization. Hopefully we all add value to our organizations.
Of course.
Okay, I think, yeah, so I'm just going to give you another couple of seconds, and then we will end the poll and I'll show you the results on the screen.
Okay.
So a bit of a division there.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so 65%.
Is that what you expected?
Yes, I think it is. I think I'm pleasantly surprised, actually. I'd be very, very, very nervous if lots of people had said no. But I wouldn't have been surprised if that had been the case either. So, but it's interesting. Yeah, 65% saying yes, which is fantastic. So hopefully this webinar will add some additional things for you to consider. And for the 35%, somewhat, maybe we can nudge that more towards yes by the end of today's saying, but no promises, right?
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, yeah, thank you for those. Okay. So the first topic area then is, who are our customers? So I want to start with a quote from Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker was one of these famous kind of management gurus from the past. And he said there's only one valid definition of a business purpose, and that's to create a customer. So once a business has been created, it's the customer who determines what a business is. Now, I don't imagine that anyone's gasping in awe at this quote, thinking, wow, we've never thought about that before. But what's interesting is just how organizations sometimes kind of lose the sense of that. You know, we get so busy with other things, other tasks, there's other priorities going on, that it's easy for us to lose sight of the fact that the reason we're all there and working away is to ensure that we serve those customers. And if we fail to do that, we could end up without a business at all. So it's really, really key that we're in touch with our customers and that we're doing the right things to help them along. So we're going to explore that a little bit more depth. So one of the reasons why sometimes people maybe struggle to understand how they relate to their organization's customers could be driven from this. So this is a typical organogram. Most organizations have these in some form or another. And they tell us, you know, who's the boss at the top, who are the heads of various functions and divisions, and generally who's reporting to who. And for that purpose, they're absolutely fine. But what's happened over the many years is organizations have maybe started to take this model too far and use it more as a blueprint of how the organization should operate. Now, one of the famous consultants from the past, Deming, had a huge problem with this because he said to organizations, this diagram doesn't include your customer, nor your supplier for that matter. Now, of course, we would all say, well, of course it doesn't, because they're a separate organization. They've got their own staff. They're a different legal entity. But what Deming argued is that your customers and your suppliers are just as much of your organization as a system as your various processes and departments are. So in PMI, we use this model to help organizations to begin to think of themselves more as a system. That's a network of processes that are all intertwined with each other that are trying to serve the aim of the system. And one component of this model, this piece of theory, is highlighted there in the top the top right-hand corner, which says it generate information from the system and the wider environment, which includes the customers. So what we're looking for there is, or for you to reflect on, what are the processes today that your organization has that are dedicated to listening to the customers as well as other factors? So most organizations have got something in that space, but it's worth having a think about. So if we take a more simplistic view and say, so what is a process? Well, at the end of any process, there is a customer. That customer is receiving either a product or a service. So that's the output. And that's created from the work that we do, so the activity. And of course, activities or work require inputs in order to generate those outputs. So fairly simple stuff. But if we want to have a good, effective, and efficient process, we need to be using the data from the work itself as an input into the process, as well as the standard inputs. But we also need to have an input from the customer in order to tune into their needs, wants, and expectations. And we should treat that input just as importantly as we do any other input to the work itself. So we can, and of course, it's not just a one-shot grab the data, because of course customers' needs and wants change all the time. So if we don't have that constant channel of communication open, we might find ourselves in a situation where the products or service we provide are no longer cutting it against the current customer needs. So another element of the idea of customers is this customer chain idea. So for some of you, you might be in a process that does indeed deal with the direct and final customer of whatever it is that your organizations do. But probably for most of you, that's not the case. You're not directly in touch with those customers or directly providing the product or service. But however, you're more likely providing yet another internal department or process, and then eventually the goods or services get to the final customer. So in that situation, you can think of your main customers as not just the final, let's say, external customer, but also those internal customers as well. And the logic behind this is if you think of a continuous chain of processes that all have to work together to deliver something at the end, if each one of those linkages is treating the next area as their direct customer and exploring their needs and wants, even though it's maybe just our friends or colleagues, the whole process is likely to perform more effectively. And it's often these internal handoff points where we've never really explored what the requirements are of those recipients. And that causes there to be interference or inefficiencies in somewhere in that overall chain. And that, of course, can then eventually damage the experience that the true external customer receives. So for those that maybe voted for the 35% that voted on the poll that they, somewhat agree with how their work relates to the customer, it could be that you ought to be more focused on your direct customer. Because for most of us, at least, the external customer can seem like such a distant person who's far removed from our daily work. Okay, so another challenge that we face, of course, is that whatever process you work in and operate, there are hopefully the needs of the customer are present there, but you have all of these other voices as well. You've got the boss saying that he wants certain things from the process. You might be heavily regulated, as many industries are, and they're putting lots of pressure and requirements on the process as well. So which of these voices do we listen to, and how do we prioritize all of this? Well, our guidance on this is that it's the requirements of those end customers that really should be central to the organization's goals and targets. And the other voices, such as the business and the regulator, can't be ignored, of course, but are better regarded as constraints, things that we're going to just have to deal with in the pursuit of providing that value to those true customers. So that's one way of kind of rationalizing all of that noise that you might be facing into. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about typical sources of customer data, a few points on this. So some organizations might say, well, yeah, we've got a portal for our customers to engage us if they have a problem, right? There's a button they can press on the website, or there's a ticket they can fill in to sort of complain if they've had a bad experience. And of course, whilst this might be partially useful, it's not necessarily going to capture everything. I mean, for instance, if you think about your own experience of being a customer, if you've been out to maybe a nice restaurant maybe and had a meal that was under par, you may not take the time to tell them or fill in a survey. You may just simply never return. So relying on this source of data alone isn't really what this webinar is about. You also might have NPS or Net Promoter Scores. Many organizations have these kind of metrics running. And again, whilst these are useful, they are an indicator of how your organization is doing for your customers. Think about the data they provide. They give us this kind of, the promoters versus the detractors. But how can that data really be used to develop your competitive advantage? It gives you an indication of how well you're doing for now, but what about tomorrow? What about your future products or services? How are you going to develop those with only those kind of indicators? So we need something beyond just these gauges that give us a feel for our customers, happy or disappointed. So the real crux of the voice of the customer is this idea of proactively discovering customers' requirements, putting some energy and resource and attention into that, not just listening when customers are having a bad experience, and discovering their needs before they become problems. Because of course, once a customer's had a bad experience, that might then be too late to recover. That might have already damaged the relationship or damaged the brand image or something else. So we don't want to be waiting for those instances. We want to be proactively getting out there and really trying to get in the minds of our customers and exploring more about what it is that really switches them on. Quality, when you're engaging with customers, just a mute point here, is actually a very complex area to explore. So we should never think of quality as just one aspect, but actually There's multiple facets to quality when we're trying to explore that in more depth, such as how the product or service performs, the schedule adherence in terms of how it's delivered, cost, serviceability, after sales. There's a whole bunch of dynamics around the idea of quality. And this little model that's in the corner here, I'm going to explore this with you all in the next section. So what forms of data can we gather from our customers, and what techniques can we use? So I want to just explore some research by someone called Dr. Kano, who gave us this model that really explores a different way of thinking about sort of quality, but also a really useful way of thinking about how we can separate customer requirements into different categories or types. So the way that this model works is that the horizontal axis is degrees of fulfillment. So how fulfilled does the product or service fulfill the needs of the customer? So on the right-hand side means it does a fantastic job. It fulfills everything they want. On the left-hand side, doesn't really fulfill anything. And in the middle, kind of halfway house. The vertical axis is the degree of satisfaction. So more of an emotional response. So at the top of that scale, really ecstatically, overjoyed. Where it crosses the other line in the middle, kind of a little bit just, not really bothered. And down at the bottom there, probably quite upset and angry even. So I want to use an analogy to explain how this model works. And we're going to use the chat for this. So this is a bit of an experiment. So I want to set the scene for you. Imagine that you're going on holiday. You've arranged all of your travel needs. So you've booked your flights, you've arranged your transport to get you from the airport to your accommodation. The last thing for you to do is to book a hotel. And let's say, for the sakes of this discussion, it's going to be a hot holiday. So what I'd like you to put in the chat is, what are the sorts of things that you might be asking the tour operator about on a phone call if you're trying to arrange this hotel? So what might be some of the things that you may be inquiring about? So if you want to drop a few ideas in the chat there, and Suze can read them off for us and see what we've got.
Yeah, so we've got what facilities are available. Right. Is there air conditioning? Actually, air conditioning is running top at the moment.
Maybe that was my emphasis on hot holidays, perhaps.
Yes, and I think also recently it's been hot here, or certainly in the UK. We've had some heat that's made us all wish we had aircon installed at home.
We have, yeah.
So yes, how far is it from the beach?
Okay, all right. Okay, so really typical things, right? These are things we would imagine ourselves talking about on the phone. And Dr. Kano said these sorts of customer requirements have a name, and they're called wanted. And they have a relationship with those two axes that looks like this green line. So the more we fulfill the wanted requirements from the customer, the greater the customer satisfaction is. And the less we fulfill them, correspondingly, the more disappointed the customer is. So if they wanted air conditioning, it's got to be near the beach. And I can't remember what the other one was.
You've got some gym facilities required as well, Damion.
Got some gym facilities, right? You get there, it's miles from the beach, there's no air conditioning, and there's no gym. They haven't fulfilled any of those requirements, and as correspondingly, you're very, very angry and upset. Maybe even to the point that you would refuse to stay there. But if they provided all of those things, you'd be saying, wow, this is just, this is one of the best stays I've ever had. I'm coming back next year. Okay. The next set of requirements I want to explore are, what are the things that you wouldn't expect to have to ask the tour operator about this hotel? Maybe because you would assume that they ought to really know with regards to your experience of having stayed in hotels before.
Okay, so put your answers in the chat. Lawrence suggested a bed. Wilson, interestingly, has suggested, Blair has suggested good service. A lockable door, some bathroom towels. Right. In these days, an ensuite. I do remember very early in my career going to being booked in by my company to a room where the bathroom was shared and down the corridor. That wasn't so much fun. Oh, Wilson was right. Sorry, Wilson. Carol suggesting we need bed sheets and pillows.
Absolutely, right. All of these absolute basics. And Dr. Kano said these are what he called basic quality, or expected, as we have them on this model. And these have a relationship, as you can see, like as per this red line. So even if the hotel fulfills all of your basic expectations, there's a bed in the room, you can lock the door, you've got a toilet there, and so on and so on, you're not jumping for joy, because they are just, you just expected those. And of course, as those aren't fulfilled, there's a very rapid descent off into being dissatisfied, again, to the point where you probably would refuse to stay. And then there's one last category that he talked about called delight factors. And delight factors are things that you can provide that instantaneously get the customer onto that plus side of satisfied. So this might be, you turn up to the hotel and they say, we've given you a free room upgrade, bottle of champagne on ice in the room, all expenses on us. You're probably immediately, if not maybe slightly suspicious, you're going to be on the plus side of satisfied. So why separate these requirements? Why do that? Well, Dr. Kano believed that customers won't talk about the expected because they believe that you as the supplier already know what they are. And of course, that's often not necessarily the case. So there can be an awful lot of opportunity and learning to be had in not just going back to your customers and trying to explore, the new and the exciting stuff, but maybe just checking in on how are we doing on the absolute basics? Are we missing something that might be detracting from their experience? Once you've made sure that you're doing a good job on expected, you can then work tirelessly on trying to push those wanted things further up the green line. So just because a customer says they want something doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you can provide, but at least now you know, and that might become your competitive edge. And of course, then if you're doing great on those, by all means, you can start playing with these delight factors. The other thing to say on this, of course, is that delight factors will not mitigate for the absence of those basic expected requirements. So there really is almost like an order of a hierarchy, if you will, to how these requirements are used. So for me, I thought this was a really fascinating piece of research. And if you're planning to go and engage your customers, whether they be internal or external, using this framework as a basis on which to think about what would be good questions or areas to explore, it gives you a really nice framework for doing that. Okay, so that's after Dr. Kano. So there's lots of different methods available to us in terms of getting the customer voice. So there's things like focus groups, there's face-to-face interviews, questionnaires, surveys, those kind of things, observations. One of the ones we do encourage is face-to-face, if that's practical. And of course, in the current climate recently, that's obviously not been the case. But the idea of the face-to-face is that there's less structure there, which means that the customer has more latitude to be able to explore and for you to explore things in more depth with them. And you really don't know necessarily where they're going to take that conversation, as opposed to something like a survey, which can often be very rigid and only explore certain areas. Observations, of course, might include things like your mystery diners that you get in things like retail and restaurants and so on. So really putting yourself in the customer's shoes, in fact, directly in there, in order to really truly understand what it's like for your customers. I think that's a really fascinating way of drawing out insights.
Damion, before we move on, one point Lawrence mentions, actually going back to the Kano model, is that about the risk of delight factors becoming the expected. There's the classic example, isn't there, that we're all familiar with these days around when you started to be able to take photographs on your mobile phone. That was a massive delight. If I bought a phone today and I couldn't take a photograph on it, I expect it. It's not even something I want, I just expect it.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely true. It's delight factors. As soon as you've allowed the customer to experience the delight factor, it may almost immediately become wanted. And the reason customers don't talk about delight factors is they didn't know that you could provide them. So delight factors, yeah, they very rapidly become wanted, and over enough time, and sometimes that can happen quite quickly, they just eventually become expected. So think about many consumer products. Mobile phones, I think, is a great example. If you had a camera on a mobile phone probably 15 years ago, you'd have been, is that even possible? Whereas nowadays, you would probably just naturally expect that they would all have that. And so companies have to constantly keep reinventing those, what's the next delight factor that's going to keep us with that competitive advantage. So that's really the job of your sort of your design teams and research and development and those kind of departments.
And also I've got a question from John, which is related to your slide on methods to gather customer feedback, or is pertinent to this, I suppose. His question is, how do you manage the scale and the comparability of data to measure the voice of the customer from the both business and process perspective? He's actively considering the best way of assessing what all the data is telling him, and he's finding that a challenge.
Right. Okay. Wow. I mean, I think I could be talking about that for a while. I think that's quite a complex problem there. What could I say on that, really? I suppose it's because, yeah, people do have that problem where they've got thousands of customers. So, where do you start? What many companies do is consider breaking them down into market segments, because different market segments might have different needs and wants, and therefore you can start to crunch through the data in that regard. But yeah, otherwise there's many different techniques, I think, as to how you can process. In fact, later on at the back end of this, we'll be exploring just some of those methods as to what you can do with that data. I don't know if it will specifically answer that question, but it might. But yeah, I think I don't know if I could answer that just on a quick webinar, I think. But if you want to have a chat afterwards, by all means, get in touch.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, John. Do get in touch. Drop us an email. I'm actually going to be on holiday next week, so drop an email to Damion, and happy to chat through some of that with you. Thanks very much, everybody.
So another method we can use, which is really on that previous slide as well, is this idea of journey mapping. And Peter Drucker said, the importance of getting on the same side of the desk as your customer, walking in their shoes. What's it like for them? And journey mapping often includes investigating or identifying even what they call the touch points. And then for each touch point, you can then start to figure out what's called the moments of truth, which is really exploring, what is the customer thinking, not just thinking, but feeling in those interactions with you. And what I really like about this method is it kind of broadens the horizon for what we consider to be the interaction with the customer. It's not just when we give them the final product or service. How did they, what was their experience in finding us? What was their experience long after we maybe sold them something? Do we stay in touch? Do we provide them any after support? And it looks at the whole breadth of that. And one of the real fascinating example of this was many years ago, an insurance company was doing just this, the journey mapping. And they were looking at, how do we, kind of grow the market and get more people. And they looked at, well, how do people find it? What did they see when they put our name into Google? What comes up? And so they tested that. And one of the top hits in Google before it landed on their main page was a news article about how this company was going to be laying off a significant proportion of its UK staff, which of course is not the best message to be putting right in front of their customers who may be thinking about about to open up a policy. So I just thought that was fantastic. This idea that we explore all of those touch points, both before the interactions really begin with us, and also during, and of course after as well. Another element to think about is variation. So this is often referred to as the hidden requirement. So customers don't necessarily express this well, but what most, if not all, customers expect, so it's back to almost a Kano model of the basic expectations, is whatever it is that you deliver to them, they expect it to be consistent, because inconsistency really annoys us or frustrates us. And we can all think about that just from our personal lives. So using some of the measurement methods to really begin to understand our performance and the variation of that performance can have a huge impact on what your customers think and feel about the products or services that you offer. I mean, this particular example here is the availability of access to a bank's online banking facilities, which was running at average 96%, which is probably 1% higher than their service level agreement that they might have signed up to, which is typically 95. But of course, look at the variations. Some of those days in that, some of those weeks even in that chart there are down as low as 93%. You know, what were all of those? What was that 7% of customers thinking of feeling when they couldn't get onto their account? So it's not the average that customers experience, it's the variation. So that's another important consideration. And for those, if you have people in your organization that are trained to look at that, so people that are green belt, black belt trained, or been through our process management training, they would be able to, they would have the skills and knowledge of how to do that kind of analysis. So really important point. So we've been out, we've done this proactive stuff, we've gathered this customer data. What do we now do with it? And there's a number of different things that we can do with customer data to help our organizations, which in turn is going to help our customers. The first one is this. It's the idea of how the organization is structured again. So back to one of the earlier slides I showed about the organogram. You know, traditionally that might be how we've started to use that as a blueprint. So organizations traditionally were very functionally orientated. They had very set functions. Most organizations still do. And when you have that really strong functional kind of operation, the question is, which one of those, if any, is engaging with the external customer, which could be none of them, by the way. What we're trying to do really is move more towards identifying what are the end-to-end processes that deliver the value to the customer. And it's the processes really that determine how the organization should operate. So we weren't saying get rid of functions and just have these kind of multi-disciplinary teams that can do all sorts. Functions are still very useful. In terms of things like setting budgets or training people to have particular skill sets that differ from other functions. But it's the processes really that should prevail as the main backbone of how the organization operates. So using this notion of the customer is king, you know, the Drucker quote, can really begin to drive even a restructure of how your organization operates, which I think is really, really fascinating. Another thing that you can do with customer data is develop something called a value proposition statement. And these can be used to actually replace what we would normally say is the purpose of the process. So, and these are derived again from the customer's point of view. So, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If the idea of if the process only exists to serve a customer, it makes perfect sense that we use their needs and wants to explain what the purpose is of the process existing at all. And it's a high level description of what the customer values. And the way to structure these, which I really like, is this second bullet point. So as a consequence of us doing what we do, whatever that might be, the customer can do what they do better. And I just love that. I think that's such a great way to again, put yourself in their shoes, in their perspective. How is it that we help them to do whatever they're in the business of doing? And if we can find our way in to be the best provider at helping them to succeed, they're likely to always come back to us or you even. And it's going to form that real long-lasting relationship. Here's a coffee shop example of a value proposition statement. So we help our local customers to feel good and do good by fueling them up with artisanal coffee in a community-focused space. Sounds like quite a fancy coffee shop to me, but there you go. Okay. So in terms of what customers value, I thought I'd put this slide in just to talk about this. So I was once told one way of thinking about this, which was derived around cost. Because of course the word value is synonymous with costs. It's normally what we associate. But in truth, customers value far beyond just price. It could be things like the quality of the products or services you provide. It could be to do with the convenience, how available are they? The optional extras that you provide. And on top of all of those characteristics, these days it's moved even further. Now we have considerations on things like social responsibility. What's your company ethics? What's your policy on sustainability or the environment? So, if you think about going out and buying clothing, you might not necessarily buy it just because it's the cheapest. You may well buy it because you like their policy on where they source their raw materials from, or that they're able to recycle it, or maybe even they offer some sort of recycling program. I think that's been a recent movement with one of the top high street firms. So those kind of things now are much more at the forefront of the customer's decision-making process in terms of the way that they go out and purchase goods and services. So how do we define customer value? So here's a couple of quotes. This one from Convey back in the early 90s said, value added is activity which is one which contributes to the customer's perceived value of the product or service. Non-value added is one which, if eliminated, would not detract from the customer's perceived value. And another quote from Womack and Jones from the Lean Thinking book in 1996 was, non-value added activity is an activity which absorbs resource but creates no value. So why is this important? Well, if we can pinpoint and crystallize what it is that customers value, then we can start to analyze our business through what I've said here, a new lens. We can start to look at the work and the tasks that keep us all very, very busy. And you can even begin to categorize them into these three broad areas. We can find the work that truly adds value in the customer's eyes. We can find work that is necessary but non-value adding to the customer. So those sorts of things are activities that we have to do because of maybe legislation or regulation or something like that. And then, of course, we can identify the activities and tasks which are non-value added, which means that they are no benefit to the customer nor the organization. And from an improvement point of view, it's these non-value added activities that we're trying to seek out. If we can seek those out, we can eliminate them, and means the customer is just as happy as they were before, but we're probably now much more efficient at what we do internally. So it's kind of a win-win for both parties. And this is really the essence of the idea of, for those that have understand it, the lean 8 wastes. So if anyone's familiar with those, you'll understand where this comes from. Another really important thing that you can do with customer data is how it can be used to drive the selection of the measures and metrics and targets and so on that you set yourselves within organizations. So this is a simple model of a 5-step process. It generates an output that comes out the end. And most organizations tend to measure at that point. They use something that's called results measures. So results measures are measures that summarize a whole bunch of activity. How profitable have we been? How many complaints have we had in the last week? What's our on-time delivery performance like? So on and so on. And results measures are useful for gauging how happy the customer may or may not be, assuming that they're associated to the customer needs. But the process measures are measures that exist within the actual work itself, right down there at the low level where people are busy. And the idea of good process measures is that they have a strong causal relationship with the results measure. So there's a technique we have in PMI where we can use a matrix approach to distill the needs of the customer into various characteristics. We can then associate how well the existing results measures relate to those customer requirements. And then we can trace back from those results measures back into what are the process measures deep down in the fabric of the organization that are going to affect those results measures. And what I really like about this technique is it brings that what might be an external customer need, which could feel very far away from people who are just doing the day job, and it translates it down back into the results measure and then right the way through to the process measure. So as an operator or as just someone in the organization, you can then more easily think about, how does my work that I do every day, how does that relate to that process measure? And then I can understand how that relates to a distant results measure or KPI. And I can even understand now which customer requirement that links into. So I think that's just a very, very powerful way of developing measures that are enabling a much more larger proportion of the workers to tune into how they can contribute to that value proposition statement that we were just talking about. And then finally, how do we set targets, or how do we assess performance? So this is something called a capability analysis. I know it looks a little bit technical, but this is a way of using, again, the voice of the customer to express where are the boundary points, what are the limitations as to the performance of certain things in the process. And organizations I've often come across who they're measuring themselves against some target or some requirement, but it's not from the customer. They're beating themselves up over some arbitrary target that maybe someone internally has just created. It doesn't reflect the actual customer's true sentiments of their voice. So when you use these kind of methods, we always recommend that the limits, the red lines as it's shown on this chart, are actually derived directly from the customer's mouth, let's say, as opposed to just being some kind of arbitrary target that's been set internally. So to finish on, back to where we started, really, the definition of a business purpose is to create a customer. So I'm hoping that some of the things I've touched on there have maybe made you realize that there are different avenues in terms of either gathering customer data, or maybe some of the ways in which you can use customer data is now different to maybe what you might have been doing already. Okay, so just to summarize then, so organizations exist because of the customers, so therefore it's central, they should be central, to what we do in all of our processes, no matter which function you're in. Customers aren't just the end user, but anyone who receives the output of a process. So if you think that you're far too removed from, your external customers, think about the customers that are closer to you. Even though they might just be your colleagues, start to engage them around the idea of just treating them like any other customer. And you'll often find some really fantastic opportunities that helps them do their job better, and then they can help their next customer, and it kind of gets passed on. Defining what customers value helps us better identify waste. So you can learn the 8 wastes in Lean, and you can go out and start finding them almost straight away, because some of them will be obvious, but it's only when you've really truly understood what your customers value can you better pinpoint and define the difference between value add versus non-value add. Goals and metrics should have the customer's requirements at their heart. So all too often we start measuring all sorts of other things because it's something that the boss wants, or it's something that finance want offers. But really our metrics should be more heavily driven through those customer needs and wants. And we should proactively discover what customers value way before they start experiencing problems. So don't just listen when they're complaining, but be proactive, get out there, run surveys, set up interviews, or even go and experience the product or service yourself as a great way to get first-hand experience and insights. And enabling your customers to be better at what they do is really key to maintaining your competitive edge. If your company can distill that and focus in on how it achieves that, then you're going to have long-lasting customer relationships way into the future.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Damion.
That's all right.
Before we close, if anyone's got any other questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Also, if you are around next week, then Warren Knight is going to be talking about what makes improvement continuous, and in particular, how to sustain your improvement efforts. I know this is a great topic, and it's something that we're regularly asked to help with. Everyone gives us feedback about topics they'd like to cover. So looking forward to seeing you for that. And then the following week, we have Dennis joining us, who will be covering making digital reporting effective so that you can make more informed decisions. And certainly, Paul, that might be useful based on the conversation and question you had earlier. So hope to see you there. If you haven't registered for either of those, then go to pmi.co.uk/webinars. Remember, if you can't attend, but you do register, we will send you the recording on the Monday. Finally, do look out for our Voice of the Customer survey. You're going to receive that shortly. We're really grateful for your feedback on today's session and also any suggestions you have for future events. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you, Damion, for being in that first hot seat as we return after
it is
our
quite
summer.
hot here as well.
So on behalf of PMI, Damion and myself, I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone for joining us today and wish you all a very safe and relaxing weekend.
Yeah,
thank you very much,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.